Hello everyone and good evening. My name's Don Arleth. It's 8 o'clock local time and welcome to our main edition of World News Tonight here on TVP World. Tonight, our main focus is on Brussels. NATO defense ministers met to discuss security challenges here in Europe, and President Zelenskyy pushed his victory plan to garner more support from his Western partners. We'll have more on this in just a bit, but first off, let's take a look at tonight's headlines. Europe understands Polish migration policy, says Polish Prime Minister Donald Tusk. Hamas leader Yahya Sinwar, the mastermind behind the October 7th attack on Israel, has been killed in Gaza. And the most popular chain of convenience stores in Poland began trading on the Warsaw Stock Exchange today. All 27 EU leaders are meeting in Brussels for a key summit focusing on growing migration issues, including pressure at borders and disagreements over asylum rules. Leaders also discussed Europe's economic and security concerns. Now let's go live to our correspondent Sasha Farbach in Brussels for more. Good evening, Sasha. Now, migration was the elephant in the room today, when compared to other topics at least. So have there been any concrete decisions made?
Yeah, hi there. Good evening, Don. Indeed, major elephant in the room. Actually, originally, this was not planned on this council meeting. This is something that was added a bit later, just some days back. So it has become the main issue here today. Currently, right now, leaders have made a break. They've discussed migration at length. Now, what we're hearing so far is very much, I think, importantly, as you pointed out earlier in the intro, that Donald Tusk very much has made this his mission. He came here this morning very much with making an understanding of that migration is a European issue, that there are dangers. It's a hybrid attack by outer forces. Something needs to change on a European level and scope, and that's exactly the kind of support he seems to be getting here. Now, there have not been any conclusions reached at this point in time. At this point, many of these communiques and assistants are running around trying to change those joint statements to see if we can get conclusions later on as leaders are currently breaking for dinner. But I think it's key already what we're hearing from different delegations is that the Polish have been leading this debate here, that Poland through Donald Tusk has very much the upper hand here, convincing not only people on the fringes of Europe who are experiencing the border crisis, but also major players. Let's hear what Prime Minister Tusk had to say as he arrived here earlier today at the summit.
I wrapped up all the meetings with key players that I had lined up and achieved everything I wanted to. Most importantly, I was met with understanding. It was never about suspending the right to asylum wholesale, but a temporary local measures introduced wherever the border is being crossed illegally, by force, especially on the Belarusian border. Everybody here understands that intention, and nobody's disputing Poland's right to temporarily halt asylum procedures.
Now, one key thing here was about border protection. I remember this was a sore spot as well. I remember that there has been problems, especially with Schengen, with Germany raising those internal controls, much to the dismay of Poland not that long ago. But in the discussions here today, I mean, that has been brought up, and it also has been touted by the Germans that current border controls and internal borders of Europe are a success for Germany, and those would likely only be removed once the external borders are taken care of. Chancellor Scholz, as he arrived here today, also gave his opinion on migration. Let's listen to what he had to say.
The issue of asylum and migration will also be a topic for discussion today. We have made great progress with the common European asylum system, and measures taken by individuals, such as Germany, with our increased border controls, have also led to a significant decline. I have led to irregular migration and also to the fact that returns are more successful than in the past, and we need to continue working on this. I make no secret of the fact that it is important to me that this agreement on the common European asylum system is not only gradually implemented, but accelerated. In Germany, we will submit the necessary laws to the German Bundestag very quickly. But it would be good if this could be implemented sooner everywhere in Europe.
Now, as we said, the final conclusions have yet to be made, but so far on many countries, they have mentioned that they agree with Poland's plans. They agree that more needs to be done. Some of those ideas are what they've been touted here as innovative solutions, which translated means in these return centers that Prime Minister Meloni has already touted here in success with Albania, potentially even something with Syria, but it's not something that the entire Union supports at this stage. But one key takeaway is that Poland has been leading the debate on migration here today in Brussels, and Europe is listening. John, back to you.
All right, Sasha, far back there in Brussels, thanks for your report. Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy visited Brussels today to present his new plan for victory to European and NATO allies. What was the response to this plan? Our correspondent, Mark Steele, has more.
Volodymyr Zelenskyy's victory plan did not gain much traction here in Brussels today. An EU source said that no breakthrough discussions took place during the European Council summit, which is taking place here in Brussels. German Chancellor Olaf Scholz said that Germany's position on the matter hasn't changed, while Hungarian Prime Minister Viktor Orbán said that the idea is terrifying. Despite this, Volodymyr Zelenskyy said that Ukraine will fight on, even if there's no allied support for his plan.
Ukraine truly deserves to become, so they thought, NATO member one day, and we must do everything to ensure this happens. That is why the first fundamental point in the victory plan is the invitation to NATO.
So what is actually this victory plan? The plan consists of 5 points, and 2 are most contentious to Western leaders from the European Union and from NATO. One of them is about inviting Ukraine to NATO now, and the other one is about allowing Ukraine to strike targets deep inside Russia with all Western equipment. Volodymyr Zelenskyy presented this plan not only to the European Council today, but he also presented it to NATO defense ministers who met at the NATO headquarters for a 2-day summit.
President Zelenskyy, dear Volodymyr, it is great to have you here at NATO headquarters. I look forward to the day that Ukraine is here as a member of this alliance. And until then, we will continue to do all that we can to ensure Ukraine prevails. This is vital for our shared security.
Volodymyr Zelenskyy did not manage to meet with U.S. President Joe Biden during the Ramstein format meeting, as Joe Biden canceled his visit because of Hurricane Milton. A meeting is not scheduled between Zelenskyy and Joe Biden, who is visiting Berlin tomorrow. He will meet there with German Chancellor Olaf Scholz, French President Emmanuel Macron, and British Prime Minister Keir Starmer. Brussels, Marek Steele, TVP World.
And as we've just seen, Ukrainian President Volodymyr Zelenskyy presented his victory plan to EU and NATO leaders in Brussels, calling for more aid from his Western allies. To win in the war and grant Ukraine a chance at a just peace, Kyiv will need both enormous amounts of weaponry and ammunition, as well as clear paths to join the EU and NATO, which can guarantee its sovereignty and security.
It seems that whenever the topic of aid to Ukraine gets brought up in Europe nowadays, almost all parties in favor of supporting Kyiv have the same opinion. Too little is being done to ensure Ukraine's victory. The question is, what does Ukraine really need to secure its victory against their invader?
It's not a question of a dollar amount or a euro amount. It's a question of what capabilities the West is giving Ukraine. 35 billion, whether it's in euros or dollars, is cheap. That's a cheap price to defend liberty.
First up is the military aspect, arguably the most important part of Kyiv's plan for winning the war. While the soldiers on the Ukrainian front remain determined to defend their country until their last breath, determination alone isn't enough to shoot down airborne targets. While the US is still committed to sending Ukraine top-shelf munitions, the upcoming presidential election brings uncertainty to Washington's support for Kyiv. In the case of a Republican victory, many wonder who will step up to the plate if Donald Trump decides to cut funding to Ukraine.
I think Poland is the country that's been leading that, but it's certainly going to take Germany stepping up far more than they have. And there are some encouraging comments. Friedrich Merz, who's the head of the CDU, the main opposition party in Germany, has been calling for Germany to do just that, to step it up.
Additional ammunition and weapons are great, if you can use them. To gain the upper hand in the war, Kyiv has been pleading with its Western allies to let them take the initiative by striking targets inside Russia with long-range missiles. So far, however, these efforts seem futile.
And this is possible. It's just a matter of political will, and the resources are there. Basically, the technology is there. There's a technological advantage also there. It just needs the right policies and the right decisions.
Other avenues to guarantee Ukraine's safety include inviting Kyiv to join international blocs, namely NATO and the EU. That too, unfortunately, is not something member states of these blocs are ready to commit to as long as Moscow's missiles fly through Ukraine's airspace.
Ukraine will only enter NATO when it will not need NATO that much anymore.
With major changes in the structure of NATO already underway and still on the horizon for the country heading it, Ukraine's defensive capabilities, safety and the prospect of ending the war on its terms are now mainly in the hands of the EU and its dedication to keeping Ukraine Russia-free.
Now let's turn back to migration, which was indeed a huge topic of discussion today, not only in Brussels, but also in Rome. Polish Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski traveled to the Italian capital for a two-day visit and a meeting with his counterpart, Antonio Tajani. When it came to migration, the two ministers said that their interests are more aligned than ever.
Polish Foreign Minister Radosław Sikorski was welcomed in Rome on Thursday in a rather friendly atmosphere. While his center-liberal coalition doesn't always see eye to eye with the Italian conservative government, there is one topic on which the two camps have found common ground.
The recent move by our Prime Minister Donald Tusk, his presentation of the migration strategy, only goes to show how our interests align today.
The Polish foreign minister made a distinction between the Polish-Belarusian border crisis and illegal migration to Italy through the Mediterranean Sea. While he said the two are different in many aspects, the end goal, according to him, remains the same.
Our societies demand to bring back control over the borders. Both our governments believe our external borders need to be under control. Consulates, border guards and visas need to mean something. As a group of independent nations, we have the right to decide who enters and who doesn't.
According to migration analysts, European ruling parties need to meet the voters' expectations on border protection sooner than later, especially if they don't want to fall behind the recently rising popularity of far-right groups.
It's not a matter, I think, of stealing votes off the far right, but it's addressing a set of concerns that are particularly attractive to far-right voters.
Both Poland and Italy are demanding more assistance from the EU when it comes to the protection of their borders. These discussions are still ongoing.
Yahya Sinwar is dead. The leader of Hamas was shot and killed by Israeli soldiers during a firefight in Gaza. The Israeli Defense Forces has just confirmed this information. The clash took place on Wednesday in the Jabalia camp, a densely built-up area in the northern Gaza Strip. Israeli soldiers found the leader of Hamas accidentally during the course of an unrelated mission. Graphic images circulating on social media show Yahya Sinwar's body with a gunshot wound to the head. Israel considered Sinwar to be the mastermind behind the October 7th attack, which left some 1,200 people dead. Israeli forces have spent more than a year hunting for him. Earlier reports suggested that Sinwar was hiding among the Israeli hostages, using them as human shields for fear of an airstrike. However, no signs of hostages have been found in the area where he was killed. This coming weekend will be filled with choices for Moldova. In addition to electing a president, on Sunday, Moldovans will also participate in a referendum that could cement the country's EU accession path. Our correspondent, Karolina Stoltzman, is on the ground in Chisinau. Good evening.
Good evening, Dawn.
So can you tell us?
Maya Sandu was first elected to be the president of Moldova back in 2020. Now this, if she is re-elected, of course, would be her second term. And it was actually Sandu that put Moldova on the European Union roadmap. Now, right after Russia launched its full-scale invasion in Ukraine on February 2022, this is when Moldova applied for a European Union membership. And just a few months later, in June of 2022, they were granted a candidate status. Now, the referendum that Moldovans will be voting on, it's not actually about the accession itself, but it is about amending the Moldovan constitution to include the European ambitions. If Moldovans vote in favor on the referendum, that would mean that a future treaty on the actual accession would be much easier and much quicker for Moldova. Now, it is necessary for 1/3 of the adult Moldovan population to vote in the referendum for it to be valid. But of course, there is a certain tensions when it comes to both the presidential vote and the referendum itself, as there is a lot of Russian influence that has been seen in Moldova in the coming days, in the days leading up to the elections. And that is things like the scandal where Russian agents were seen influencing people, bribing people to vote against the incumbent president, Maya Sandu, who is clearly pro-European, and instead vote for people who are much more pro-Russian, pro-Moscow. So the Moscow's influence in Moldova is definitely seen, it's definitely clear, and it is of course in no interest of Moscow for Moldova to become a full-fledged member of the European Union. So it definitely will be an interesting weekend ahead of us, and of course I will be here to keep you updated on that. So back to you, Dawn.
All right, thank you very much for that. Indeed, all eyes will be on Moldova to see in exactly which direction it heads. Karolina Stoltzman reporting from Chisinau. Thank you. Support for teaching religion in schools continues to decline as new generation of Poles shuns the traditional way of life. Now, the Polish government has set up a committee to take a closer look at religious education in schools. Aaron Dahmen reports.
Are schools in Poland facing a crisis of faith?
There are only 12 hours of religion left in the schedule. Last year, there were 20. Currently, 41 out of 630 students in this school attend religious classes.
Across the country, religious classes in public education are plummeting in popularity with kids.
When we have religion classes, students who are not participating can do their own thing. They can just take out their phones or books, study or read, use headphones so as not to disturb the class. If someone doesn't want to go to religion class, they can just sit in a hall.
The government set up a joint subcommittee to look into the issue after meeting with bishops this week. And it's clear the numbers tell a sobering story for the church. According to analysis by Poland's Public Opinion Research Centre, just 51% of adult Poles support the presence of religious classes in schools, which is reportedly the lowest figure since that survey began in 1991. Meanwhile, previous research from the same pollster revealed 93% of students were attending religion classes in 2010, but by 2022, this figure had dropped to 54%. One expert says religion's strict view on social issues could be part of the reason for the drop.
And I think that religion has a very specific way of seeing life. For example, today we talk a lot about marriage for all, we talk about liberty, about equality between women and men, we talk about abortion, and religion has a very conservative view about those topics.
But the church maintains it still plays a role for Poles.
Polish identity is quite strong and always in our history, like today, was connected with the Catholic faith. Of course, the situation, the real style of life is changing.
In May, Education Minister Barbara Nowacka announced that from next year, religious classes in school would be reduced from 2 hours a week to 1. TVP World reached out to the Ministry of Education for comment, but received no response before going to air tonight. In other countries, like Ireland, the Catholic Church has seen a dramatic decline, with the nation emerging as largely secular. It seems Poland could be on the same path.
The Żabka Group, which runs Poland's most popular convenience store chain and translates to frog, has begun trading on the Warsaw Stock Exchange. The company's initial public offering is one of the largest in Polish history.
The mood on the Warsaw Stock Exchange was jubilant on Thursday as Żabka released its IPO. The exchange's CEO remarked that the event symbolizes an end to a difficult period and a new chapter for the Warsaw stock market.
Żabka Group's IPO is the largest taking place on the Warsaw Stock Exchange in years. It is also the largest IPO in Europe in the second half of 2024. We have waited a long time for this moment. This is an opening of a new chapter in the history of Warsaw Stock Exchange.
Żabka's IPO is the fourth largest in the history of the Warsaw Stock Exchange, after e-market Allegro, insurer PZU and the PKO BP Bank. It includes some 300 million shares priced initially at 21.5 Polish zloty, about €5. By midday, the price had risen slightly, by about 1%. The Żabka Group controls a number of companies, including individual catering provider, individual catering platform, 2 grocery delivery services.
Bardzo serdecznie chciałbym podziękować naszym franczyzobiorczyniom I naszym
I'd like to thank our franchisees, over 9,000 of them, who each morning open over 11,000 stores to serve 3.6 million Poles each day. You are the face of Żabka.
The company is continuing its expansion. After securing a store on nearly every corner in major cities, Żabka is now moving into mid-sized and small towns. It hopes to nearly double the number of stores operated by its franchises.
President Zelenskyy traveled to Brussels today to communicate his long-touted victory plan to Western leaders. This was supposed to happen last week at the Ramstein summit, which was called off by President Biden due to Hurricane Milton that hit the United States. That didn't stop the Ukrainian leader, though, as he traveled to France, Italy, Croatia, and Germany to garner support for the plan. After this whirlwind trip last week, when President Zelenskyy returned to Kyiv, the mood was rather somber. And after today's meeting, there's still no major breakthrough to report either, which begs the questions. Are we failing Ukraine by not allowing it to defeat Russia? And what exactly happens next? Now joining me to discuss is Ruben Johnson, research fellow at the Kazimierz Puławski Foundation. Good evening, and thank you for joining me on World News Tonight.
Thank you for having me. How are things there in Warsaw?
Yes, well, actually, things here in Warsaw, I would say, are not as, they're similar to Kyiv, and I'd say many people in this part of the world are very nervous about what's going to happen next there, as I just pointed out. One of the first points I think that we've heard from President Zelenskyy for a long time now, both when he was back in Washington for the General Assembly in September and all the way up until today, he talks about a just, lasting peace. And the first point of his peace victory plan is to have an invitation into NATO. Do you think this is the major taboo point of the peace plan, or is this just one of them?
Well, it's the most difficult point because some of the members really shy away from that because of the security guarantee, the Article 5 aspect, that any attack on Ukraine would be deemed an attack on the alliance as a whole, and everyone would be obligated to respond.
Right, but if I can just throw out a hypothetical for you, if you will, there seems to be a bigger push for Ukraine to sit down at the table and have some kind of peace talks. There's also, it seems, behind the scenes, there's also a lot of talk of maybe Ukraine giving up some of its territory. And if we put that together with what we're hearing from President Zelenskyy saying that there will be no just peace unless there are concrete security concerns, I don't think there's any other possibility other than NATO membership. Would you assume, or would you agree that this would be a last resort in the event that Ukraine is pushed to the table?
Well, I don't think Ukraine sitting down at the table is going to guarantee NATO membership. I agree with everyone that Ukraine needs to have NATO membership. They need the security guarantees. There's no question about that. But the people who talk about Ukraine giving up territory simply as a quick and easy way they think can end the conflict are deluding themselves, because first of all, there's no guarantee that Russia will observe any agreement whatsoever. They haven't observed anything yet so far. The Budapest Memorandum, the Minsk agreements, the only reason they make agreements is so they can break them.
Mm-hmm.
And secondly, we have to acknowledge, and there's no country that understands this more than Poland is, if you say, okay, these categories are now occupied by Russia, you're talking about a massive migration of people. People will leave those territories, and they're not going to stay in Ukraine. They're going to come to Poland. They're going to come to other countries within the EU. So I think there are people in a hurry for this conflict to be over, and they are pushing for it because they will not have to live with the consequences of the decisions they force upon Ukraine.
Now back to President Zelenskyy. He presented his victory plan to various Western leaders, yet none of them are too impressed. What part of this plan do you think is still so unacceptable to Ukraine's biggest Western partners?
Well, other than the NATO membership point, one of the aspects is containment of Russia via a non-nuclear strategic deterrent package that would be deployed on Ukrainian soil. So in plain English, what that means are precision strike weapons that have conventional warheads, but would be capable of hitting targets within Russia that have strategic value to the Russians themselves. That's probably the other point, other than the NATO membership, that people shy away from, because they're already not allowing Ukraine to hit targets inside of Russia with the weapons they've been given to date.
Allowing Ukraine to use Western weapons to strike targets deep in Russia is not a game changer, according to the Biden administration. But enabling Ukrainians to build their own weapons to strike targets deep in Russia is. Why the paradox in this rhetoric?
You asked a really great question that lots of us have been screaming about for months and months and months. In reality, there really is no difference. It's simply that Putin and his allies within Russia, his mouthpieces, they keep rattling nuclear saber because it always works. It's always a threat that's out there. But I think this has been discussed, and the Russian nuclear arsenal is basically unusable. And if they were to use it, they would lose everything. They would lose far more than they would gain.
Based on what we're seeing on the front lines in eastern Ukraine, I mean, we see a bad situation in Pokrovsk, as well as Volodar has just recently fallen. Renewed, it looks like, effort towards Zaporizhia. Are we failing Ukraine at the moment?
In the eyes of many people, yes. Yes, we really are. There's a number of weapon systems that they need more of. We need to step up production in our own countries for our own purposes as well as for theirs. But yes, and there's a very, very dark sense when I talk to people in Kiev. There's a very dark sense there that the West, as the collective West, has really let Ukraine down. They won't say they've abandoned Ukraine, but everything short of that, they will say.
I get the same impression. Now, also, there have been intelligence reports by the Germans and others who say that NATO could face a direct conflict with Russia by 2028 or 2030. Are the decisions that are being made right now, and let's say this, if Ukraine doesn't defeat Russia, can it be certain that we will enter a direct conflict with Russia, NATO and Russia?
Barring some cataclysmic event in Russia that destroys the regime, yes. I mean, one of the events you're referring to is the testimony this week by the German Federal Intelligence Service director saying that we can expect a war by 2030. Everyone keeps saying this. If Russia is not defeated, and they're not defeated decisively, and they're not humiliated in defeat, they will be back. And we can see by the numbers of North Korean artillery shells, roughly 50% of what Russia is using now. We can see by the reports that there may soon be a unit fighting in Ukraine composed of some 10,000 North Korean volunteers written in air quotes. We can see that the Russians are going to have plenty of help. They decide to go and take on the rest of Europe.
Yep, well, it indeed seems like a Chamberlain moment here in Europe. Ruben Johnson, Research Fellow at the Kazimierz Puławski Foundation, thank you for joining me on World News Tonight.
Thank you, sir. Thank you again for having me.
Thank you. And that concludes this edition of World News Tonight. Thank you for watching. Have a wonderful evening, and we'll see you next time. Good night.